The cornerstone of neoliberalism is putting forward markets. So markets are at the key of this whole ideology. We can also speak about a marketization because the market, so to say, comes first, but is also considered as kind of a last instance of decision making in many different areas, which range from politics to the economy to even private things, education, about the children. So the idea was that the markets are the best institution to decide about all this, and that by their very nature they reach an equilibrium. Now this would go too deeply into economic theory, but anyway, the marketization is a key issue. Then there was a set of terms which are put down in the Washington Consensus. So if you want to study that more detailed, then you even could go just on Google and search for it. So the Washington Consensus was passed in 1989 by the IMF, the World Bank, and representatives of the US government and of the US Congress. And it was about helping saving, changing countries in Latin America, which had a high degree of debt, foreign debt. Today, of course, we have also many debt problems, if you think about Greece and Italy and so on. And, anyway, they had kind of a standard recipe for that. First of all, you start with austerity. Maybe it rings a bell nowadays in the European Union. And then there was a set of policies: liberalization, deregulation, privatization of formerly state-owned companies. So I guess this sounds all very common. We are still, in a way, living in this period. And the last very important element was foreign direct investment. So in a way, an externalist idea of modernization built on external resources. It is so important because it served as kind of an experimental field. As Milton Friedman, one of the main proponents of neoliberalism, put it. And experimental field, why? Because there was the idea that after the breakdown of state socialism and of the planned economy, you can start from the scratch. And so to have a much more radical version of reforms and of neoliberalism than you could have in the West, where there might be democratic resistance and where it might not be that easy to implement. So that is why it is so important. However, it was implemented also prior to that in Latin America. So it's not only Eastern Europe, it's a global thing, neoliberalism. It also fostered globalization. And nevertheless, Eastern Europe became a major place where it was implemented, which then, however, had a lot of consequences for the so-called old Europe, so to say, Western Europe, and of course for the countries of origin, meaning the United States and Great Britain, where it all started under the governance of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. To put it in very short terms, I would say the greatest achievement is Poland. Even so, Poland still has a lot of pockets of poverty. It has become a kind of a medium-rich country. It's not poor anymore. And in '89, it was really poor. I even made calculations in my book, and it came out that according to the government statistic, what people earned, if you put that then in valuta, so to say, in foreign currency, which was actually the real currency then, dollars, average Warsavians made around $60 in 1990 per month, per capita. And they had to spend around half of that for food. So this is really living literally from the spoon to the mouth. And nowadays, Poland is besides the fact that it is an important member of the European Union, it is a fairly affluent country. It's not poor anymore. So that is certainly an achievement. If we think about problems, of course, all those reform countries have problems. Poland has as well too much of out-migration, so too much loss of human capital. Of course, still a lot of poverty, even in places or cities which are doing well, like Warsaw. But even more so on the countryside, which also had some political results. But if you then turn our attention more to the West, I think the main drawback, if you look at Britain and Brexit, this was basically the mother country of Thatcherism and therefore neoliberalism, and it has left behind too many people and too many places. And there was a backlash on all that, and that was basically that eventually Europe, London, became identified with this neoliberal order, and there was a vote against it. The Brexit was much a vote against Europe, but it was also a vote against neoliberalism and against the City of London. And I think that's the main drawback also if you look to the US, that too many people were left behind, felt marginalized, that they really don't have prospects for the future, and then voted for right-wing populists. In Germany, I have a chapter on Germany in my book, and the impact on, so to say, the old Western Germany was what I call code transformation. Initially, there was this idea that Eastern Europe would be the experimental field, and for Germany, that means that East Germany would be the experimental field. Everything would have to change in the East, and basically nothing in the West. This came out of this kind of winner mentality of the Cold War. We're the winners of the Cold War. Our system is superior, and it doesn't have to be changed that much. But that also had a backlash, and the German reforms, that's a long and difficult story how this shock therapy did not work. But anyway, the German government in United Germany still tried to react by raising social expenditure, so basically by pacifying, in particular, the East German population by social expenditure, creating a social safety net, which is, of course, not that neoliberal. But eventually, they couldn't pay it anymore. Rising debt, loss of competitiveness, and eventually they introduced quite radical social reforms between 2001 and 2005. Interestingly enough, the Social Democrats did that. So the reformist social democracy did it. And so one can say that eventually the neoliberal reforms transformed all of Germany, also West Germany, and abandoned part of the old welfare state, and above all, changed it a lot. So this is what I call code transformation. Then you ask about Southern Europe. Now, it's too complicated to go into great detail here in a brief interview, but in Southern Europe, basically the changes arrived after the crisis of 2008, 2009, and the Euro crisis. These countries had, above all, the debt problem. Now, debt in the sense of too high expectations about the future and then too high debt, which cannot be paid back, that is also as something which is typical for the neoliberal period. Of course, not exclusively. You had it before, if you think about 1929. But anyway, there was too much speculation going on, and eventually the creditors didn't want to finance the debt anymore and the state budget. And then what came up then after the Euro crisis in 2010 was austerity. First and most important chapter of the Washington Consensus, which I mentioned in the first question. So saving, especially in the state budget, and that caused a downward spiral in those economies. Italy, for example, hasn't overcome it until today. And well, then there was supposed to be a set of reforms, liberalization, deregulation, privatization, which was kind of half implemented also because of democratic resistance against it. But this was then the Southern European course, and unfortunately it didn't work very well. It seems that either one really follows a strict neoliberal course like the Baltic states, or one follows a more Keynesian reaction, This is what actually Germany did, Austria, also Poland, interestingly enough. So East-West doesn't function anymore in that way. Slovakia, reacting in the Keynesian way to this crisis. And they got out of the crisis better than Southern Europe, which is still, unfortunately, not in good shape. Now here we need to distinguish on the terminological level, which is difficult to do. But basically, both are intertwined, capitalism and neoliberalism. I mean, the idea of neoliberals was to strengthen capitalism and in this way to create then more prosperity and freedom, above all, economic freedom. Neoliberalism is about the political economy, above all about economic policy. And capitalism is more broadly spoken about the functioning of the economy or of single enterprises. So I would say it's a different direction of study. The one more leaning towards political science, and the other clearly could be studied also in an economic department. They are mutually interdependent. Now, neoliberals would, of course, argue that capitalism, the economy, works better under those conditions. I don't see such a clear causal relationship that the more neoliberal you get, the better the economy works. I think there's many evidence against that because neoliberalism can be very self-destructive. Now, if we put up the relationship in the other way, and maybe introduce democracy into that. Capitalism can function without democracy. Maybe even neoliberalism can, and maybe neoliberalism is not that democratic at all. That's what I'm trying to show for the 90s, and how these reforms were implemented. So it can damage democracy. The other way around, I think it would be more difficult to prove a connection. So that is, I think, one of the major problems we are facing today. The capitalism can function without democracy, but a democracy can function without capitalism is a very tricky question. But anyway, I think here we have a very interesting relationship which needs to be further studied. Well, the answer is very brief. Of course, it was very useful and it was a prerequisite that I could write my book at all. So I have a great degree of respect for social scientists. I also used some social science methods. For example, there are some statistics in my book, some attempts to calculate as well. So in that way, it is fairly interdisciplinary. First of all, it is important what is called in the English-speaking world transitology, coming from transition and then studying it. The transitology, it has created a huge amount of data, which were indispensable for my book and which historians should know. So that is kind of the factual basis. On the other hand, much of the older literature was written basically in the mood of the time. Very often in support of those radical economic reforms. And in that way, a part of the transitology needs to be read as a source, as a historical source, and needs to be critically interpreted. So in that way, I think the work of the historians with the distance of time can reach different conclusions than the transitology could reach in the 90s or in the beginning of the millennium. So I think this is one basic function of history, to review not just what has happened, but also what was written about what was happened. So basically on a meta level, on the reflective level. Historians can also learn a lot from the work of ethnologists and anthropologists, because they try to immerse themselves into the transformation. And there's very important studies like Elizabeth Dunn Privatizing Poland. That is one book which really inspired me. And she moved into a factory and looked at the privatization process on a everyday level. Now, historians can't move back and do something like the participant observation, but we can try, and we should try to go micro. I think the micro level, that is where historians should work on mostly, because most of this transitology was done by political scientists, by economists, so most studies are on this macro level about national economies and about then, well, privatization, large-scale privatization policies. So I think what historians can and should do is to zoom in. That's also what I tried to do in several chapters of my book, to zoom in on cities, on rural regions, on single groups, and so on. I think there's a major task there in order to understand this recent period of history in Eastern Europe, but of course also in Western Europe. As I said, it is a pan-European story. I can give a brief answer to that after a long interview. I was an 89er, and I happened to be in Prague because of a variety of connections, also family connections, and so basically I witnessed it in November, then again in December, and it was just a wonderful experience with a lot of hopes, with the idea that there would be a very different kind of freedom, giving also equal chances, that there would be a degree of solidarity, and freedom also understood in a broader sense, that you really have a chance as an individual to live the freedom which is offered, which is not just economic freedom, but to have the resources. So it was also a pretty, I would say, egalitarian and democratic revolution, also liberal in the very sense that from the very beginning it was built upon the goal to build constitutional governments and a respect for laws and human rights, which were constantly violated by the communists before. So it was a time full of hopes. But then already in the mid of 1990, it was clear that this revolution would get a different turn. And this is basically what brought me to the topic. I wanted to know why this particular revolution took this neoliberal turn. I would argue already pretty much in 1990. So thanks for this interview and your good questions, and I hope you have fun watching it, and that you also will have fun studying the history of Europe before and after 1989.